Well, welcome to yet another of our Black History conversations. It's really great to have some new faces on the screen today who've heard about what we're doing, and especially delighted that Ian McCracken has been able to join us today. Ian's an independent researcher from Glasgow. He has done some work with Glasgow University, but I apologise that I didn't send out quite the right information on the original flyer. So we'll hear from Ian about the range, his research to find out about the range of Glasgow's Black History links. Now, this is a theme that we're following through, Black History Exploring Local Stories, because one of the things that has become really interesting is to find that there are so many aspects of Black history, and that in all communities we can find stories. So just to say that I'm Liz Millman from Learning Links International, and I've been working with Simon Fringo from Belong Nottingham and David Alston from who's written the book on slavery and Highlanders, slaves and Highlanders. Sorry if I've not got the title quite right, but I'm sure David will tell us more. And also that Marcia Dunkley is with us. Marcia is also supporting us as we continue with the fifth season of Black History Conversations. And at this point, I really smile because it's just been an amazing experience, and we're delighted to welcome all of you. Just join us in future on any occasions you want to. And if you want to find out what we've been up to over the last 50-odd sessions, then they're all recorded and by Simon and posted on the Black History Conversations website, along with the Belong Nottingham website. So because I'm in Australia, I just have to say that I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, their elders past, present and future, because this land belongs to the sovereign people of the First Nations, and it never ceded. It always was, and it always will be. Okay, so we are geared up here to be celebrating Australia Day on the 26th of the month. So should we be calling it Australia Day? This is a big debate. Or should we be calling it Invasion Day? Because it celebrates the British invasion of the continent and the countries and communities across Australia. The strapline to Australia Day this year is Reflect, Respect and Celebrate. We are making some progress, I would argue. I'm using the term we here, I am a resident. And it's great that NITV is going to have a whole series. I know you won't be able to watch it, but I will. So I can watch it from the 19th to the 26th and see a whole lot of interesting programs, but I will share some stuff with you again. So I think that's as far as I need to go. All right, and I just put some more information about that on the slideshow. So we're going to be exploring Black history, moving forward and rethinking how to tell the local stories of Black history found across the UK. We have with us today, and I'm really delighted, Bernard Janke. Bernard is the director of the Jamaica Memory Bank, but today he's standing in for the director of the Institute of Jamaica, and I'm really grateful that and delighted that you're able to be here, Bernard. It's obviously we're looking at local Black history, but every bit of local Black history has a link with somewhere else in the world, and a lot of instances we come across, the links are with Jamaica. So we're really pleased that we're able to engage with you and your colleagues at the Institute of Jamaica and the Jamaica Memory Bank. Thank you for joining us, Bernard.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay. Now, Ian McCracken is with us today, and he's been researching where he lives, where I'm not sure if it's where you come from, Ian, but Glasgow, and looking at all the different Black history stories in Glasgow. So Ian, are you there?
I am indeed, yeah.
Like seances, this somebody was saying, you have a Zoom session and asking who's where. So Ian, I'd like you to introduce yourself, explain what you've been doing, and tell us all about so all about the Black history stories in Glasgow. That's our first focus today. Thanks ever so much, Ian.
Yeah, and thanks very much for inviting me, and hello to everybody wherever you are in the world. It's noon in Glasgow, so a good time for me, and much better than some of the other times. Basically, I got interested in Black history as a result of seeing the horror of the George Floyd incident, which had a positive impact in a lot of places, and that people started wondering about their local Black history and wherever they were. So I thought that would be an important thing to do for Glasgow. And I worked in education. It was in the Glasgow School for a number of years, and I had met the person in charge of multicultural education on a number of times, and I knew that she'd written a book. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it. It's called Who Belongs to Glasgow, and covers the story of various groups of people from various parts of the world, including the Highlands, Ireland, Asian subcontinent, but also included Africa. But what slightly worried me when I first bought the book was that while all the other chapters were about Italians, for example, or Poles, the one for Black people was just called Slavery, which I felt was a bit narrow of focus. I wouldn't say it disturbed me, but it was sort of out of sync with what the rest of the chapters were. So anyway, I read it, and there was quite a number of Blacks who were not slaves that were mentioned. So I was quite heartened by that until I started looking into the lives. And some of them, she got the professions wrong. Some of them, she even got the names wrong. And this is somebody that was a multicultural education officer. So it's it concerns me, and it still concerns me, because this is really the only source in sort of the public domain for people to read about Blacks in Glasgow. So I decided that I would try and find as much as I could on as many different aspects. What I'm intending to do now is just go through the different areas, and I'm sure there are plenty others to be explored, but this has taken me about a couple of years to put together. And basically what I've been trying to do is, I was a librarian before I retired, was to sort of put information together. And I have made contact with a number of people for example, journalists, with people with Glasgow University and other institutions to try and get some of this out to a wider audience. But I must admit, it's been quite a challenge, I'm afraid. However, without any more ado, I'll just start. I suppose befits a librarian, I'm going to do the different areas, each is like a folder, and I'm going to do them in alphabetical order. So the first one was anti-slavery and abolition. And although Glasgow's often known for a lot to do with not just slave owners, but in particular those involved in tobacco and cotton industries whose fortunes were founded in having plantations, and mostly in the West Indies. A lot of that money found its way into beautiful buildings in Glasgow or into funding things with the Glasgow University. And that story is often told, but what isn't so much told is the amount of work that was done in Glasgow for the other side, the anti-abolition movement. And a lot of Black campaigners, including a number of former enslaved people, actually came to speak in Glasgow to huge audiences. So I've looked into some of them. The most famous one, which I'm sure you'd be familiar with, would be Frederick Douglass. And I've got a lot of resources on him, and the National Library in Scotland, in fact, had an exhibition devoted to him, which I was able to go to. So I thought that was an important one. But he was
That's
well
really
known.
important. Ian, can I just interrupt? Do you
Of
mean
course,
to
yeah.
have your video switched off?
Yes, I've got quite a lot of information on screen. which
Oh, right.
I'm just,
Okay, that's
which just
fine.
makes it easier for me to concentrate without seeing any of
Okay,
the
that's
gestures you
great.
might be
Thank you.
making at me. Um, but thanks for checking though. Another one, and I hadn't certainly heard of them, so I started doing my research, was a Hallie or Haley Quinn Brown, who was a Black American who had been a slave and who did a lot of lectures, and she also sang at various concerts in Glasgow. So I've got a lot of stuff. And I know there's a Danielle Swertzer at Glasgow University, who's been doing a lot of information. Danielle's based at Glasgow University. I mean, she talks about a lot of the money she made from her lectures wasn't for herself, it was to support Black education, which was really good. So it wasn't done as a commercial enterprise, it was done as a philanthropic enterprise. Um, um, there's another Ida P. Wells, I don't know if anybody's heard of. She was another
Yeah.
Black abolitionist who came to Glasgow, and that was in the 1893, and she was also a suffragette. I came across her when I was doing research into Scottish suffragettes. Was also, and this is one of the ones that was mangled in the book I was referring to. It's Sarah Raymond, who was, according to the book, a Black sculptress based in Glasgow, which was complete rubbish in all respects. She was actually, again, another Black American coming to speak about the appalling conditions in slavery in America, and also, in some cases, looking at issues to do with lynch mobs, for example. And there's quite a lot of her. Another mistake in the book was talking about a William and Ellen Croft, who are in fact William and Ellen Craft. And again, they are supposed, according to the same book, to have been resident in Glasgow, and they were in fact in Hammersmith, which is certainly not a suburb of Glasgow the last time I looked. And they were a quite amazing couple who had escaped from slavery by in quite a remarkable way. The wife, Ellen, was very light-skinned, so her husband pretended to be her slave, and she passed as white, so that they were able to escape. And they thrilled audiences in many places coming to Glasgow and talking again to huge audiences. And of course, this meant that there was a tremendous amount of support, excuse me, that was given to the anti-slavery movement from Scotland, which, as I'd say, I feel is underrepresented. Now, some of the other resources that I've come across is there's a place in Glasgow called the Trades House, which was, as you could deduce, was where they had the incorporations of all the different trades people, and they have a very good physical and online library, and they've got a whole range of resources online regarding various anti-slavery actions, like including the complete contents of reports, annual reports from different years and so on. So I think that's a really helpful resource. And again, I'll happily share these in chat. The other one, which you may be aware of already, is the Samuel J. May collection at Cornell University. I did a search in Glasgow on that, and there was a huge number of entries connected to Glasgow. So that was all stuff that I thought would be useful. There's even poems that I've found by the Women's Society, and there's also a National Library of Scotland. So there's a lot of resources there which I feel are really considerably underused. I'm just going to pause for a minute so I can hopefully share that link I was talking about. If you bear with me a minute, please.
Thank you very much. Well, this is really fascinating because as different people come from different perspectives, your perspective as a librarian and realizing where there are library resources, it is really fascinating. And looking at the different people who visited Glasgow and spoke in Glasgow. Now, not every city will have records of those, but I was just going to ask Marcia Dunkley. Marcia, have you found in your work in Birmingham that there have been different people who came? I think, well, I'm sure there were.
Definitely so, yes. I mean, and that's why we've been able to create our tours so easily, because it's information that was always there underground, and we've just brought it to the forefront. So the whole thing of Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, people know them as symbols of civil rights activists, but we've also created that balanced narrative that you had people like Catherine Impney, who was a white woman who enabled and supported Ida B. Wells to be able to do what she did. And there's the balanced narrative. We've also highlighted the fact that there were particular councillors that worked with Thomas Sturgeon, with the Quaker movement, to bring about this. And it's this that needed to be highlighted, because that was a poignant part of this narrative that's balanced. And people didn't know about Catherine Impney or the other councillors that we found that supported this. Oh gosh, yes. There's so much gaps, it's unbelievable.
Thank you, Marcia. That's lovely. Right, how are you doing, Ian?
Yeah, I've posted both the Glasgow collection and the Samuel May Cornell collection, but I'm also going to put in the Wikipedia link for that William and Ellen Craft, because it's a story of people.
That's absolutely fine. I'll just wait and keep on the conversation going while you're getting
thank you. Yeah,
put forward for us. That's really lovely. Okay, then. So it's fascinating to be looking at the what people are doing in different areas, and as I said, this is one of the themes that I want to follow through. Now, Audrey Judy has been working away in Yorkshire and has got an amazing contact list, and she's also got an amazing knowledge about Yorkshire. So Audrey and I have had some small conversations, because Audrey hasn't particularly pulled all that history together, but it's what we're trying to do, I think, is to try and think how this could happen, because if teachers are expected and folks in the community are expected to understand more about Black history, it's got to be made more accessible. So it's those sorts of ideas that we're looking at the moment, and obviously we very much appreciate everybody's input and support. So Audrey, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about the links that you've or the history you've found in Yorkshire, just very briefly.
We're talking about our Black abolitionists that came over. Frederick Douglass and Sarah Parker Raymond were both based in Leeds for quite some time, because we had in Leeds there was a Quaker businessman called Wilson Armistead, and they used to come, you know, I think he went to America and met people over there, and they used to come and visit him. So on the 1851 census, I think it was, William and Ellen Craft were staying with him in Leeds.
Right.
So they were on the census, you know, and he said, you know, escaped slaves. He put it on there on the census. I mean, it wasn't an essential thing, but he was making a point. So yeah, there was quite a good anti-slavery society in Leeds, and it was one of the first that made women equal with men. And so they had a symbol, you know, that symbol that says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" It said, "And am I not a sister, a woman and a sister as well?" So but I've only got a little tiny picture about that big of it. I'd love to see it properly done. Yeah, but so yeah, we found immense amounts of Black history in Yorkshire, everything from slave traders, plantation owners, and people from Africa and India who settled here way back, you know, in as early as the end of the 1600s, the odd one. I mean, I'm not saying there's millions, it's not like London or anything like that, but it's surprising that in Yorkshire, which is not considered a place that would have much Black history, up the Dales, in the, you know, the seaside places, there's history everywhere you look.
Thank you, Audrey. That's lovely. So how are you doing, Ian? Because I
Yeah,
can't see.
ready to start the next section if you're.
So what have you, can I just clarify with you, what have you done with what you've put? Because it's not popped up in my chat yet,
All right.
but I'm in Australia, so it might take a little while.
Has anybody else got it?
Can't see it at the moment.
No,
Can you press return so you can see it in the chat?
I thought I had, but I'll double check. If you bear with me a minute, please.
Well, let's do a practice about how we can put things in the chat. So any of you can just put something in the chat now, and then we'll be able to see if the chat's working, and then see what Ian's putting
Yeah,
in.
I see what's happened. It devolved to Bill rather than to everybody. Sorry, I hadn't spotted that. Oh no, right, it was because Bill had put up a post, and my next one had gone to him rather than to everybody. So sorry about that. I hadn't realised that Bill had a post. I just thought I was doing to everybody, but I will do now.
Oh, I
Right,
see.
definitely to everybody.
Right,
so
lovely.
that should be the one for the Trades House
Here we
slide.
are. Right. Okay. Lovely.
Thanks for keeping me in the right track.
That's quite all right. This is why this is a conversation. And since we've said from the very first copy, this is about practicing how to get better at using Zoom. So thank you to Catherine, Marcia, and everybody else who put in a word in chat. Thanks very much indeed. We've got that now. So we'll be able to.
That should be the Cornell one as well.
Bill Hearn's also saying that, I can't find it, Bill. Where has it gone? That Equiana spent time in Yorkshire, and there's a Leeds edition of the interesting narrative. Oh, fascinating.
Yeah,
okay,
I was just adding to Audrey's point.
Yeah, yeah, thanks very much, Bill. That's great. Okay, back to you then, Ian, and off we go again.
Yeah, I'm just going to put that Ellen and William Craft again in the chat, if you bear with me. I'm a bit out of practice in doing these sessions. Apologies for keeping people waiting.
No, it's all right. I wondered, Bernard, are you able to put your contact details and the Institute of Jamaica in the chat, please, as well at some stage when we have a break like that? Thanks, Ian. That's come up now, and we've got that too, so we can look up about Ellen and William Craft on Wikipedia. That's fantastic, really good. Thank you very much indeed.
So the next section is, and this is lesser information in that, but it's about Africans studying in Glasgow, and an organisation which for part of existence was independent, for most of it was actually an association with Glasgow University. It's called the African Races Association, and I've got a great social event that they had in the late 1910s, which has got a list of people that were members, which could be great for further research. I've also got their constitution, and I've got one of the university handbooks. It's the only digital one, and I should interject that I don't have access for a variety of reasons to the University of Archives, and mostly it was because a lot of this was done under various lockdowns. So even when they resumed opening, it was only to sort of people that were actually based at the university. So I hope at some stage to be able to go in and look at more handbooks, although the staff were very helpful in the archives in trying to find out more resources, and they thought that there should be more research done into it, but I don't think any has actually been done. But it's quite interesting, and certainly because of the amount of money that had gone to Glasgow University, they had an excellent section, as far as I can see, doesn't seem to be in where it was, which was in their university story, about a number of the Black Africans that had studied there. One, the author of that, who belongs to Glasgow, actually got right, was a James McCoon Smith, a first Black doctor. I'm delighted to say that the new studies centre at Glasgow University has been named in his honour. I haven't actually been in it, but I do hope there's some information for students so that they know who he actually was and what he achieved, which was quite tremendous. But amongst those that went to Glasgow University was a future senior member of the African National Congress in obviously in South Africa, and that's apologies if I mispronounce his name. This was Sitsili Malema, and he was actually stuck in Glasgow at the end of the war. So he wrote history of the Bantu people while he was in Glasgow, which and I do have a PDF copy of that whole book. And one of the most interesting people I found in this was a Black Canadian called Leo Daniels, who came to Glasgow and stayed there for literally 50 years and had a number of different occupations and managed to trace some of his writings. He was a newspaper columnist, actually, in Black American newspapers, some of which I managed to get access to. And it also was mentioned in the socialist newspaper in Glasgow called Forward, although they described him as Ethiopian, which I find as personally a bit racist, but seemed to be quite common at that time. So I managed to talk to a journalist about getting an article, but the unfortunate thing is I have got some gaps in his story. I haven't been able to get access to relevant Canadian archives, but it's just fascinating to think of somebody that was in Glasgow and completely unknown, a Black Canadian for 50 years. I mean, I was particularly interested, for example, to find it was a librarian for an educational and industrial library in central Glasgow. So again, I'd be happy to share the information about him. So that was what I found, but I'm sure there's a lot more to be found about the this African Races Association. They clearly had enough African students to make that a viable proposition, and they seem to have a lot of different discussions and social events. So one for more reference.
I think that's fascinating. I think one of the colleagues from Glasgow University has spoken about Black Africans in coming to Glasgow, but I haven't heard anyone say about did you call it the African Races Association?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Quite fascinating. Fascinating, thank you.
I'm just going to put in, hopefully, that...
Are you going to put that link in now?
I don't have a link for that, but I'm going to put in that so Mudira Malema about his interesting story from the Glasgow University website, which was a number of different ones that I found there.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah,
we've got David Olsen with us as well, who's very knowledgeable about different things in Scotland. David spoke when we launched the last season 4. He just published his book, Slaves and Highlanders. So you can chirp in at any time or chip in at any time if you want, David. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. That's another link in the chat, Ian. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier, Liz, about a Black footballer. So interesting. That's my next folder, and I've got some information about him. He's in the 1880s, he was a prominent Black footballer, first Black footballer to play at an international level played for Scotland on several occasions. He was Scottish based, but after his third international, he actually moved to England, and at that stage it was only people resident in Scotland that were unable to play for Scotland. So I'm quite sure that if he'd managed to stay in Scotland, he would have played a lot more games, and he seemed to have had a great influence in the Scottish team because they had some of their record victories against the old enemy, in other words, England, when he was playing for them. it's a really interesting story. And again, I'll have a link to his Wikipedia article in a minute. But what really pleased me was that there's actually not just one, but two murals about him in Glasgow, which is really good. One is outside a cafe in a popular area. It's actually slightly down a lane, so it's not the easiest thing to find, but it's really good. It's a great picture of him in his football kit. And the first Scottish international ground, quite near the current one, was in an area called Queen's Park. And they think, and they're doing some excavation there to try and confirm that this was the site of where internationals were played. So they've got a big mural there with him and a 5-1 score against England. So apologies for any English colleagues listening, but it's great to hear of a black footballer in the 1880s and being involved in something like that, because it was many more years before there were other prominent players. But his story has been remembered. So a good footballing one. And they had a documentary with some of his descendants a couple of years ago in Scotland, which was really interesting to watch. I'm not sure if it's available online. I haven't tried to look, because there's just, I was trying to concentrate on people that less was known about, and there's a tremendous amount of information known about him already. So I was just sort of logging him, if you like.
Can I just say, Bill Hearn's just made a comment about Walter Tull.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah, that's right. Yeah, another well-known name.
And apparently,
I think he's actually commemorated on a post pillar box in Glasgow, Walter.
Yeah, that's right, Ian. He is. Yeah, he actually signed for Glasgow Rangers during the war, but was killed unfortunately before peace resumed. Otherwise, he would have been Glasgow Rangers' first black footballer.
Yeah.
But Scotland's got a fantastic track record in black footballers. Andrew Watson is a strange one because he was actually fabulously wealthy, as you know, Ian.
Yes, that's right.
Probably, almost certainly his ancestors would have been slave owners. So he is slightly different in that respect.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, as one of the comments I read described Andrew Watson as being the most influential black footballer of all time. I'm not entirely sure I would totally agree with that, but certainly I think he's probably more influential now because of that tremendous example. And as I say, the two murals that have been put up in Glasgow. So it's really good to see that he hasn't been forgotten like so many others have. Another one that I haven't done much information about is a chap called Arthur Roberts, and his diaries were found many years after his death in an attic in a house in Glasgow. It's quite a remarkable story, and it was all about his experiences during World War I. And there's actually even been a book written based on the diaries. And I'm in touch with one of the authors there. There's a great picture of him wearing his King's Own Scottish Borders cap on the website that I'm just about to share, hopefully.
That's brilliant. And I think that there's been a lot of work done now on people in the First World War and the Second World War who came from countries outside the UK to serve in the armed forces. And I think that for many communities, it may be possible to find that sort of research. And we had a speaker, Lucy Bland, who spoke about the black babies that were left behind by the American GIs in the Second World War. That was a fascinating story. And that was often a story in more rural areas. Thank you, Ian. Thank you. You've got the next piece of information there. That's great.
Yeah, and the next one is, I don't know if you're familiar with it, so Red Clydeside. It was sort of almost revolutionary issues in Glasgow just at the end of World War One. It's popularly known as Tanks in George Square, because essentially army was brought in. But one of the issues involved in this was that there was lots of black sailors called Lascars, mostly black sailors called generically called Lascars, who were working in the many major Glasgow docks. And as a prominent communist, whom some of you may have heard of because he lived to be 100 and become a lord, there was a guy called Manny Shinwell, and he's quite a sort of folk hero in Glasgow. And I was quite shocked to discover that, according to at least one source, he sort of incited riots against the blacks and claiming they were taking work away from the white workers, but essentially, I think, trying to sow discord. And there's an author called Jacqueline Jameson who's done a thesis on black sailors on Red Clydeside, which is very interesting. She's done also stuff on Glasgow's race disturbances. These are all PDFs. I'm not sure if one can attach PDFs. If one can, please let me know. But otherwise, I can send them to Liz afterwards and she could circulate them if, excuse me, people are interested.
That would be fascinating.
Could I just, I mean, I'd certainly be very interested in seeing that, Ian, because one of the puzzles I've got about Glasgow history is that, as far as I can see, if you contrast it with Cardiff Bay, with Tiger Bay in Cardiff, and with Liverpool,
Yeah,
where black communities developed and continued, and Glasgow doesn't seem to have had that, despite the large number of black seamen who were there. And I just wonder if there was something about the environment in Glasgow at the time that meant that community didn't remain. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
it's not something I've really looked into, to be honest, but I could imagine that there could be, with just so many. It was pointed out in one of the documents I read that at that stage, because it was all the British Empire, that regardless of where you were in the world, you were considered to be at that juncture a British citizen. So it essentially didn't matter who you were, so there was sort of more equality at that juncture maybe than there was later. I'm just trying to get the PDF, if you bear with me.
The other thing you could do, Ian, if it made it easier for you, is that you could just send me an email with all these on, and then I can circulate the information. Oh no, you managed to put the PDF on here.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
I'm learning all the time. The first time I've done that. So, as I say, Zoom's not something, I do I should have said that I do a lot of the research on my own because I'm home based. I do some work. I'm working in Scottish Women's Hospital for Foreign Service with somebody in Edinburgh whom I've actually never met. But often I'm doing stuff on my own. So I don't have much call to use Zoom. But I've sent that anyway.
We're all learning, as I said earlier. I'm busy transferring all your things onto the PowerPoint as well. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So the next area was combined with Asians and Lascars, because a lot of these Lascars were some were Asian, some were African. I don't know whether the term Lascar is one that is politically correct, but it seems that was the one that was most used, and it sort of shows that there was a tremendous amount of these workers from the ships being in Glasgow, and often some of them their contracts was expire in Glasgow. So I've got information about a mission that was set up for Lascars, and it was actually in the area where I grew up, and I had no recollection about that whatsoever. Sorry, no knowledge of that whatsoever when I lived up in the area. I got that information from a book, and again, I'm going to just put in the link to that, hopefully.
Thank you very much indeed. That's fascinating. I know the Royal Commission in Wales did, I can't quite articulate the name. It's the Royal Commission for Architecture and Ancient Things in Wales, and they did a research project on the black sailors who lost their lives around the coast of Wales because of the ships when they would have been maybe coming up to Glasgow. So it's really interesting. Now we're beginning to see, you know, local links about all these things and hearing
Absolutely.
of the, you know, the abolitionists who were travelling around the country and understanding the impact they had on different communities. That's fascinating. Thank you, Ian. That's great.
Yeah, and I was involved with some of the Glasgow Centenary for World War I research at the school I worked in. I did research on all those who were in the War Memorial, 64 of them, but I'm pleased to say it wasn't anything for me, but I was interested to see that there was they had managed to find out about an Egyptian family and a Hassan Hamid, and who was involved in, he was with a regiment now, no longer exists, called the Cameronians, and they don't seem to have an awful lot of information, but it was certainly at some of the major battles of 1917. So I'm really pleased that effort had been made to ensure that those who'd come from various parts of the empire but settled in Glasgow were included, rather than just sort of assuming it was only whites that were involved from Glasgow. So good on them. I'm just hopefully sent that round.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Now I'm just looking at how we're doing time-wise, because we've got a couple of other people now who've joined us who wanted to tell us about things. So how are you doing through your folders, Ian? Are you?
One more thing I wanted to mention regarding this folder, and then I've got a bit of stuff on slavery.
Right, thank you.
But I can do that quite briefly. Yeah, just bear with me. Oh yeah, this was an Indian woman who was campaigning for women to be included in an Emancipation Act that the British government was enacting in India, and she came to Glasgow. Her name was Herbai Tata, quite a prominent figure, as her daughter Mithrai Tata, and I managed to get in touch with the India Office archives, and they were able to tell me that even the people of Glasgow had very short notice about our visit. One of the main city halls was absolutely packed with people wanting to hear about it. So again, I was sort of, as a proud Glaswegian, I was really pleased to hear how much support issues like that were getting in the city. And again, I'll put in a link to her. The best one is just the Wikipedia article, which also includes her daughter.
I don't know what we do without Wikipedia.
Well, I actually did now research articles for it principally on the Scottish Women's Hospital for Foreign Service, which was based both in France and in Serbia. And they're quite remarkable studies, stories of the women that are involved in that. It's not obviously the subject of today's discussion, but if anybody's interested in amazing women, doctors, drivers, nurses, you name it, the whole hospitals were staffed by women, and they had to be evacuated over 7,000 foot high mountains because of the the destruction of the Serbian army. It's quite a story in itself. Anyway, not for today. And so the last area I've got is information about slavery, and I didn't focus too greatly on that because, as I mentioned right at the start, I feel there's been quite a lot of stuff on slavery, but there's a great book which covered slavery and anti-slavery, which unfortunately is out of print at the moment, although I have read it. It's called It Wasn't Us. In other words, it wasn't us. Sort of the Glasgow trying to pretend or assert that they weren't involved in slavery.
It's an interesting book. I've seen that one. It's sad that it's out of print.
Yes, it's really difficult to get hold of. I mean, one good thing was that they did issue copies to all Glasgow schools free of charge, or secondary schools at least free of charge. So that was quite good.
I think nowadays we've got to look at how things can go online, really, to be resources into the future, because one copy of a book which could get lost or tucked away in somebody's collection.
Yeah.
And sometimes libraries update their collections and then really good books get chucked out.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, as a matter of fact, they have put a lot based on the book on a website. I'm just about to send you a link to that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Right, okay, yes, it's the, oh, right, it is online, is it? It was Neos. Excellent.
Yeah, that's as you said, Liz, it's really important for these things to be widely circulated as possible.
Yeah.
But there's another good thesis called "We Don't Have Slaves Up Here," which was sort of looking at the contradictions or the denial, if you like, that there was about slavery issues. Hence the wasn't us. The last thing I was going to mention on this topic, and then I'll conclude, was I was researching different articles on British newspaper archives, and I came across an article from 1910 about a production in Glasgow of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it actually mentioned that some of the cast were former slaves themselves. And this is obviously what, 40 more than 40 years since the abolition of slavery. So whether they had reluctantly taken up the role, or whether they couldn't get jobs, or whether they were delighting in maybe showing another side to the slavery story, I don't know. It doesn't really go into, but it was a big Glasgow theatre called mistakenly the Meropole in the article. Again, I'll try and
again, that's a really interesting story, and I know Buffalo Bill toured.
That's right, yeah.
And had Native American Indians, and I don't know who else touring with him.
That's
so
right,
that's
yeah.
Interesting about that performance, because presumably it would have toured and it would be have gone to other places as well. And these are all things which teachers could pick up on and relate, because the whole thing with Black history over the past years in the UK, I found, being very actively involved in it, I found that it was often about American Black history and the American the Parks and those stories. But if we can get our young people and others to understand the nearness of Black history, you know, how things were happening in our towns and countryside around the UK.
Yeah.
Just amazing. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not, I'll sort of leave it there because I want to give other people the opportunity to ask questions, or the other people that joined that have their own stories, which I'll certainly be looking forward to listening to. But I'm just going to put in my email address in the chat for anybody that wants to contact me. And as I said at the start, I'm more than happy to share any information, or if anybody would be interested in working with me on anything. Sorry, it's sunny in Glasgow, believe it or not. Excuse me, just to close the curtains.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed. That's brilliant to have all this these links. I think what I've done is I've, for the last few sessions, well, quite a few sessions now, is that I fell in love with PowerPoint, and I've been doing all these PowerPoint presentations. Well, she's laughing, Dave, because we talk about how we're presenting things. But when I was looking through recently the folders from season 3 and season 2, I used to do a newsletter. Well, I've completely forgotten all about this. And I actually think with all your information, Ian, that you shared today, it would be better to do a newsletter and have all that information there, because I'm just the logistics of getting the PowerPoint onto the website is complex, and I can just put it in the next mailing that I send out then.
Well, sounds a good idea to me.
Would have that information if they're interested. Wow, okay. So has anybody got anything that they want to follow up with, Ian, on questions or anything else? Wow, I think you've overwhelmed people.
Stand everybody into silence. I'm bored and rigid. I'm not too rich.
I had a look at the link that you sent that talked about the British people that were enslaved, and that was absolutely horrendous in the 1600s, about the poor people, including children and toddlers. So
Yeah.
scooped up and sent over to America to work on plantations.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely horrendous, and some of them were babies.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I started reading that link. Very interesting. And
Yeah.
awful.
Certainly after the Jacobite rebellion, an awful lot of the Jacobite prisoners, those who didn't die in old prisons in the UK, were sent out to the West Indies. But I don't know if anybody took any records of who was being sent out there, but I imagine that a lot ended their lives there sooner or later. I don't think
Well, I
they
think
ever
we
lived.
can link that probably with the Irish story that we heard
Yeah.
about a few weeks ago as well. So that's really interesting. I see you're struggling with the sunshine there, Ian. How lovely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Caroline, will you just keep those 2 links of the PDFs for me, please? Because I can't get those links just at the minute. Okay, Audrey.
Hi. One of the things that I started off pretty much like you, but about 40 odd years ago, and I did work as a library assistant for a while and found that very useful in doing the research. But I like to go even further back, and I wonder if I'm asking Ian, does anybody look at old parish records? Because I find it very difficult to find Scottish parish records online. I can find parish records in England online, but I'm just wondering whether it's...
You have to pay to see the Scottish records, I think. Isn't it called something like Our People or My People?
Scotland's People, yeah.
Scotland's People, that's it, yeah.
And you have to pay for it?
I think you have to subscribe for that one, yes.
Yeah, you get you pay for a number of credits, and it can be really difficult to, because unless you've sort of somewhere to start, it can be quite challenging. You can spend a lot of time, not to mention money. I mean,
yeah, well, I wouldn't spend the money because I'm a state pensioner. I don't have money to waste on things like that.
I mean, you don't have to pay for actually just sort of searching. It's really if you want to download like a birth certificate or death certificate or something else. But a lot of the parish records, they wouldn't have information on unless you knew somebody's name.
Yeah, well,
I
I
know.
know. I've been doing this with English parish records for years, but we have some in some of the libraries. We have printed parish records. Have you ever had a look to see if there's any for Glasgow or Scotland?
I can't honestly say I had, because most of the research I've been doing, I've been wanting stuff that I know will be on the Scotland's People website. So there's been really no need for me to look at parish records. I suspect that the Mitchell Library, which has got also the home of Glasgow City Archives, would have parish records from various eras. But how you would manage to.
Can I just come in there? That's why the printed parish records are really useful, because if they're anything like the books that are done in England, at the back they have an index. And they do have an index, obviously, of names, but they have an index of places. So sometimes Africa or India or somewhere like that turns up in the places index.
Oh, okay.
But also in some of them, not all of them, unfortunately, it just depends, you know, the people who've been doing it. But in some of them, after that, they have a list, an index of names, an index of places, and then they have an index of bits and pieces, anything that's odd. So that's where you sometimes find Negro or Blackamoor or something like that. So if you can find any parish records, you know, books of parish records, that might be a really good way to find people earlier. There's also, I mean, have you used the Glasgow University runaway slave database? Because there's
yeah, I've looked at that and looked at a number of other things, but I mean, it was more the fact that a lot of the other aspects of Black history that hadn't been focused on at all that I wanted to look at. But parish records, I must admit, I had looked at. So with the slave index, I really wasn't interested in, because there's
it's a fabulous resource for biographical details of African or Indian people who when they run away. There's quite a lot written about them, and in some cases you get to find a great deal more. You find their names, you find where they've run from, where they think they're going to. So then you could maybe, I mean, there's one story from Yorkshire about this runaway slave called Thomas Anson, who ran away from this remotest village, and I never dreamt that he would get away. And he's on the database, I'm pretty sure he is. But then, speaking with a colleague who does history of soldiers in Britain, we discovered that he did get away, and that he became a soldier, a trumpeter, riding a fine horse, and and being in the army for 8 years. And then he lost his job because he lost his tooth. So I imagine because he'd lost his tooth, he couldn't blow the trumpet. But he then went on he got a pension. I don't know whether it was a very big pension, but he got an army pension, which certainly would have helped him a little bit. And he was by then living in London. So from what I'm saying is, don't ignore that runaway slave database, because if they've got all the information from each advert on there, you can sometimes pick up immense amounts of information. I mean,
okay, well, that's useful to know.
And one
Absolutely fabulous. Audrey, thank you ever so much. That's really, really brilliant. And that's a really good resource for others to know of. David wanted to come in now. And David, after you, we'll thank Ian very much. And then we'll just go on to find out the other things that people want to tell us about.
I think for the Scottish records, there isn't any easy way of getting into what Audrey called these odd, interesting bits, because although they're indexed, they're not indexed on. You can find, for example, baptisms of Black servants who have been slaves, but there's no way of searching for that. So I think it does come down to good local studies where people are looking at the local records, and it's only by building that up as people here are doing that we begin to get an overall picture. Although you have to pay for the old parish registers of births, marriages, and deaths, the Kirk Session records from Scotland are now freely available online. And there is also, again, not easy to search, but there is information on there, because lots of parishes, money was left to parishes to support the poor, money that came from people who'd made their money in slavery on slave plantations and so on. And sometimes you will pick up other things as well, but it all comes down to detailed study at a local level.
That's fantastic. Well, you're an expert on that, David. So thank you very much indeed. So
Yeah, thanks.
thank you so much, Ian. That was absolutely brilliant,
Thank
because
you.
the Black History Conversations was started by three of us from who were involved in community research in one way or another. David, who's been fascinated in Highlands and slavery story, and other Black histories, and also Simon Faringo, who with his refugee and asylum seekers at Belong Nottingham have done research into Nottingham's history, and then Learning Links International. We've been doing community research into the Welsh wool industry in Wales recently. That's one of our projects with Caroline, and looking at the links with the slave trade supplying the Liverpool ships. So community research is really, really valuable. And we've also, during the conversations, had the opportunities to have professional colleagues with us who from the universities, or maybe like the Institute of Jamaica, Bernard Janke. We've had Professor Sati from the university in Nigeria. And we've also had authors. So we've had a whole range of people, but this is particularly important because I think for community researchers to have some sort of a network so that we can learn how other people have done things, and along with the support from our academic colleagues, I think it will help us move along very forward. And Ian, I just recognise that you said after George Floyd's death, you felt that this was something that, you know, a contribution that you could make was to research and to share. And I think that's really true. And these conversations came really as a result of that. You know, what can we do? We need to be better informed. We need to understand and talk about the Black history of our local areas, our regions, or our UK countries, and then the Black histories of other parts of the world, and be able to understand that all these different Black histories are different. We don't just, it's not just one term that covers all. Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for listening.
It's brilliant. We're having you back again, I tell you. And when we followed up all these other interesting bits and pieces. Lovely. So I'm now going to ask Justine, and I'm just going to show Justine what I did, Justine, so that you know how conscientious and I try with these PowerPoints, but my laptop is overloaded at the moment, and it's causing me a bit of concern. So what I did, Justine, was to just put the information on 3 PowerPoints with a bit more information, but you talk us through it, please, about...
Yes. And there is also now an actual website linked to the conference since which hasn't been made public yet, but I'll put that in the chat when I've finished. So yes, that's really useful to have that slide. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's been really fascinating, and I'd like to thank Ian for a really interesting paper. That was and it's relevant in some ways to the concerns of our conference. What we're aiming to do is to think about the original African American and Caribbean slave narratives of the 18th and 19th centuries. For example, those by Equiano, who's been mentioned today, Frederick Douglass, who's also been mentioned by Ian in his talk, and also Harriet Jacobs is another interesting slave narrator from the 19th century. And we're going to really be thinking about the way in which these have been revisited in the 20th and 21st century neo-slave narrative genre. So I'm a literature specialist, and I'm actually an African-American literature specialist. So I've published mostly on Harriet Jacobs, but also on the Caribbean writer Carol Phillips from Leeds. And his neo-slave narrative, Crossing the River. So what we're interested then really is looking at the political, historical and aesthetic origins of slave narratives, while also considering how neo-slave narratives reimagine that original slave narrative tradition, its tropes and its form. So although it is literature based, we are really also welcoming abstracts from historians as well. So the kind of main themes that we might want to think about are the significance of slavery for 18th century capital accumulation. And I can see that Glasgow's history is interesting in that regard. Slave narratives in relation to abolitionist discourse, again, which has come up a bit today. And the way in which we can think about neo-slave narratives as examples of a counter discourse to ideologies that supported racial capitalism. So, and we're also thinking about neo-slave narratives as critiques of conventional historical accounts. So we also want to broaden the debate from beyond America and the Caribbean as well. We have had one expression of interest from Australia, interestingly, by an academic called Ben Etherington, who has collaborated with the novelist Sienna Brown on Caribbean convicts in Australia, several of whom went from being enslaved to being convicts. So this is a whole new area that I had no knowledge about. So I wondered, Liz, if you knew of Ben Etherington.
It was broadcast, I'll just interrupt you here, it was broadcast as a very well produced podcast, and there's been really an awful lot of interest about it, that you know, it's the direct stories of people who were enslaved and were in the services, and then eventually got transported as well. So, and I know somebody who's proud that he is a descendant of one of these Caribbean convicts. Anybody in Australia who's related to a convict is very proud of it. So that's interesting.
Fascinating, yes. So obviously there might be issues because of COVID with people traveling. So we will have the technology to patch people in, apparently, from Australia and elsewhere.
We can't rely on being able to travel to conferences around.
That's right, yes. So we're hoping to have a kind of blended environment with the help of our technicians at Greenwich. So yes, so if anyone's got any questions or would like to submit a proposal, you'd be most welcome.
Okay, so just to go back then, it's going to be 16th and 17th of June, and presumably it'll also be available online. David, you've got a question?
Yes, I wonder if I could ask you a question. I think one of the things that's happening at the moment is because more records are becoming available. And for example, I mean, last week we had Rachel from UCL talking about the plan to make available all of the slave registers, which were compulsory from 1817, and the way in which these and other sources can be used to bring together something, at least, of the lives of individual enslaved people in a way that wasn't possible before.
Yes.
So I mean, is that part of the interest? So I mean, I suppose in a way that's a kind of new narrative that's. I mean, and I suppose a very recent example of that would be Thomas Harding's recent book on the Demerara slave rising, White Debt, where in effect part of that is a narrative of those who were involved in planning the rising. So it's sort of, my question is really, is that part of?
Yes. I've recently been working on Colson Whitehead's neo-slave narrative, The Underground Railroad, which is science fiction, but he's obviously used the internet extensively because he's been able to find copies of all his adverts for slave owners advertising for recovery of their runaway slaves and so on, and he's incorporated these into his novel. So I think that definitely the digital humanities, if you like, become a very important resource for both writers and academics, and can really help aid research in this area. So definitely it would be fascinating to have a contribution on that aspect. But,
Thank you. Thank you. And Ian's got his hand up.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if you've come across the Baniba Centre for Slavery Studies at all.
no,
Based in Glasgow University. It's a Canadian called Peggy Brunache that's runs that.
sorry, I just
I've
write
been
that down. Peggy
Can you
Brunard.
just give us the name again, Ian? What's the name
Yeah,
of the
it's well, I'm going to send a link to the centre, and it's BRUNACHE.
Oh, yes,
I'll send a link.
that'd be very useful. Yes, yeah.
I mean, I have been in some discussion with them regarding my material, but so far I haven't really found anything that's particularly usable, because they're focusing purely on slavery. And if you're wondering about the name of the centre, I think it's a very moving idea that they have, because they discovered in some records, and it's all they have is the name of the slave called Baniba. So often these slaves are anonymous, so they decided to commemorate her through the name of the centre, which I thought was a really tremendous idea.
Yes, very moving idea.
Hey, I'm
Right.
not getting commission from Wikipedia, but I'm just sending Peggy's Wikipedia entry.
All right, okay. I
Thank
can't keep up with you putting all these things in this chat, and we have
Sorry.
to make sure that we share them.
I just
Thank you
seemed
very
to-
much indeed. That's brilliant. So that's what these conversations are really all about. So that's excellent. Right. Just got to change my screen here so I can see everybody. Now we've thank you very much indeed, Justine. That sounds really fascinating. Audrey, did you want to follow up on that?
It's just a very quick, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's just a very quick comment that I don't think everybody on that slave runaway database are enslaved. And certainly the runaways that I mean, I had a runaway database long before Glasgow started theirs. I started, well, I think 2004. So I've got a database that's slightly different. I've got some different ones and some the same, because anyway, but on my database, they're not all enslaved. Some of them are clearly not enslaved. Some of them might not be enslaved. So again, this is another source of biographical information. One of them, just to give you an example, is somebody who's advertising for his runaway wife who is black. And saying, no, I'm not going to pay any debts that she makes. So do you see what I mean? It's not all enslaved. So I'm trying to encourage Ian to look at some of these things, because they don't all, it isn't all slavery. It's you can.
You've got his email address now, Audrey.
Yes,
so
I know. He's going to be sorry.
Okay, then. Now, before we finish this bit, Catherine and Janet, you've both got an interest in the South African Soga family story, haven't you? So would either of you like to tell us about this?
Well, I'm going to, I couldn't get a link. It's a Joanne Ruth Davis, known as Jo, who's done tremendous amount of work on the Soga family over a number of years. She's actually written an excellent book on T.O. Soga, which she kindly gave me a copy. I got involved because I've been looking at Scottish suffrage campaigners, and I'd come across the name. This was for an event at Glasgow West End Festival in Glasgow a couple of years ago, and I'd come across the name Jessie Soga, S-O-G-A, and it sort of stuck in my head because it's quite an unusual surname, but with the pandemic, my lectures were cancelled, so I sort of put that aside then, as I mentioned earlier, went on to the Glasgow's Black History. and amongst those mentioned on Glasgow University's stories of Black students, I came across the name Tio Soga, which turned out to be her father. So I thought, I wonder if there's anybody that could, so already researching that. I managed to find Dr. Davis on Google. I didn't know the name, but I managed to find researcher on the Soga family. So we've done a tremendous amount of work together, written an article on Jesse Soga for a newspaper, and I've been asked to do a presentation as part of the conference in March. I found her invitation to me online, but I'm just putting in chat. It's quite a long bit to read, but it's all about explaining what the purpose of the conference is and the date. So that should give you all the relevant information.
Ian, that's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to put that in the newsletter as well. But can I just ask, thank you for that. Can I ask Catherine, you mentioned that the Soga Family Conference, didn't you? Are you there, Catherine? Back to the seance again.
Was it not Janet that mentioned it?
Or Janet?
Yes, it was me. I'm the.
Oh, thank you, Janet.
Yes, I have done a lot of research on the Sogas as well, and Jo Davis has visited our school because she wanted to research our archives as well. She's done a huge amount more in the way of papers, I think, than you even mentioned, Ian. Actually,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it's a huge area of study now. You probably best to have a look online, and you could probably find out quite a lot about it if you're interested. If you just look up Tio Soga, but his children, he died. He came to Glasgow briefly. He came twice actually. He was the first ordained minister. He went black ordained minister in the Eastern Cape. He went back to where he'd come from and set up a mission there. He married a Glasgow girl, Janet Burnside, who was from a weaving family, I think fairly poor background. She went back with him to South Africa, and they had 8 children, one of whom was stillborn. And he died aged only 42, and she brought the children back to Scotland, and she brought them to Dollar, and they went to Dollar Academy. So that's how I got involved in it. Then they all did wonderful things, as I said, and went back. They went back to South Africa, apart from Jessie, who Ian has been researching. The others all went back to South Africa and worked as missionaries, doctors, lawyers. Some married white girls, some married black girls. There's an enormous number of descendants, and I think a lot of them will be involved in this conference, as well as many academics.
Well, I think this is fantastic, and it's great to have advance notice of 2 conferences, both for the calling papers, but also for when these events are coming up, because sometimes we've only heard at the last minute about conferences, and people probably haven't had a chance to sign up for them, particularly during Black History Month. It was just overwhelming, the amount of Zooms there were. Janet, thank you very much indeed for that. And I made myself a little note here that I needed to say to everyone, and that was long live librarians. That's really great. So thank you, Ian. It's really, really good. Now I'm going to ask Bernard Janke, who's had a really a brilliant line. You've kept the line all the way through. Sometimes it's difficult when we're doing these international links. And Bernard, is it possible for you to perhaps do an update? Because I don't think many people on the screen actually were present when you were introducing the work of the Jamaica Memory Bank and the Institute of Jamaica. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't want to miss out on a chance of you telling us about what you do.
Oh, well, I can do quite quickly. The Jamaica Memory Bank is a project of the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica. It really is about collecting the social history of Jamaica through the lived experiences of persons going back to the late 19th, early 20th century, coming up to mid 20th century and beyond. So a lot of that history has not really been recorded and doesn't appear in, a lot of the research that has been done. We've also worked with the University of the West Indies History Department, which has a social history project, which does similar work. But we are the National Oral History Project, trying, as I say, to document the history of Jamaica from sources that are not normally recorded. So that's basically what we're about. To date, we have well over 1,000 interviews with people across the country, in practically every parish of the country. And it has become an invaluable source of material for people doing research, either on family histories or other aspects of the history of Jamaica. So, we are an invaluable resource in that regard. I put my email in the chat, so if anybody wants.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, thank you. That's just brilliant, and we really, really appreciate your support. And please, please give our wishes to your colleagues, and we'll be in touch again.
I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. So it's been a fascinating session today. David had to just give his apologies. And we've got, thank you, Ian, you've passed on Dr. Joanna Davis's email to me as well. So that's good. So we can get in touch with her. Now,
yeah, I didn't put it to everybody just because I know she's got a lot of major projects. It's a 3-day conference. So I thought if one person is contacting her, then could share the information, that's better. No offense to anybody else, because I'm sure you'd all be dying to ask her questions.
That's true. Okay, well, we'll see how that goes. Now, just to say that next week we're oh dear, I've lost my place here. Oh yes, next week we've got quite a different session. I'm not quite sure if this is going to work out, but we'll see. Professor Florence Aisi is from the University of South Wales, and she is a professor of international documentary film. And she has produced some really wonderful work, and some of the work that she's produced has been on the themes of Black history. So she arranged that she would do the presentation next Friday. We made that arrangement some time ago, and I haven't yet had confirmation from her, but we'll work on that. And we've got several other interesting conversations coming up over the next few weeks. So I'm going to thank everybody formally now and say it's been a brilliant session. Ian, that was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
You've shared such a wealth of resource. When we finish the recording, though, we can carry on chatting. But just to formally say thank you to all of you. Special thanks to Bernard Janke for joining us from all that what seems to me like a long way away. And keep safe, everybody. Keep safe. Okay, thank you. So Simon, if you're around, can you end the recording?